so today's talk is about Hainan Min, and specifically, we're going to take on a rather diachronic perspective to look at how Hainan Min as a dialect was formed throughout history. So this is the outline of today's talk. First of all, I'm going to introduce Hainan Min to those of you who are not very familiar with this variety of Min. And then we're going to go through Hainan Min and Hainan in historical written records, as well as some recent genetic studies. And then the highlight of today's talk would be talking about Hainan Min through the lens of language contact. And hopefully after today's talk, you can have a little bit more understanding about Hainan Min, and about what sort of a language Hainan Min is and how it is formed diachronically. Okay, so let's begin by answering the question, where is Hainan and why should we care about it? So Hainan Island is the second largest island of China. Any one of you know which is the first, like the biggest, largest island of China? Well, politically correctly speaking, it's Taiwan. So Hainan is the second largest island. So it has a total area of 33,900 kilometers square, and it's located at the southmost part of the country. You can see here right in this red little box, and it's in the Beibu Bay area. And despite being separated from the main continent by the Qiongzhou Strait, which is the strait here, Hainan Island has attracted various groups of diverse languages and cultures to reside over the years, with its relatively mild weather, if you don't count the typhoon that visit very frequently, and rich natural resources. And as of 2019, Hainan has a total population of slightly over 9.4 million, nearly 18% of which are non-Han Chinese. And they include ethnic groups like Hlai or the Li Zu here, Miao, Zhuang, and Usat Hui. Okay, and with a diverse population comes a diversified linguistic landscape. So on Hainan Island, we can find languages from 4 different language families. Various Sinitic languages, which mean Chinese dialects. On the right side, this is the map showing the location of all Chinese dialect. The dark orange part are the Hainan Min varieties. And Danzhou, well, some people call it a Yue variety, and you have some other, there's a Junhua, and also you have Maihua, somewhere in Sanya. And then you have languages from the Kradai language family, the Zhuangdong Yuxi, and the Mongmian language family, as well as that which is from the Austronesian family. Okay, and this part is showing you all the non-Han or non-Chinese, non-Sinitic languages, minority languages. So the speakers of these languages have undergone very intense language contact over the course of hundreds or even thousands of years, which in turn shaped the unique characteristics of all different languages on this island. However, the effect of language contact is not uniform for all languages involved. So scholars like Professor Salikoko Mufwini has pointed out that here you can say ecological factors such as the time of arrival, demographic strength, economic power, population structure, types of social interaction, all these have influenced, if not completely determined, the specific ways in which it has evolved locally. So we can't say that we have language contact on the island, so all languages involved will evolve in the same way. We have to look into the details of the mode of contact to understand how language evolve in the way they are. So in today's talk, we'll adopt more of an eclectic approach and try to work backwards in time to reconstruct some aspects of the formation of Hainan Min and its speaker community using various types of materials, from written records to recent genetic studies to, most importantly, modern linguistic evidence. And today's discussion will be focused mainly on Hainan Min and its speakers, who played a major role in shaping the present linguistic landscape of Hainan. And apologies in advance for taking a seemingly Han or Sinocentric perspective in the discussion. But spoiler alert, by the end of the discussion, I think we'll all realize that there would be no Chinese without non-Chinese. So, and the picture on the right looks a little bit unrelated, but what I want to say is that the journey of going back to the history of to look at formation of Hainan Min. Oh, I would just say we're all Alice trying to go into Wonderland, the path of Hainan through a looking glass. Okay, so Hainan Island, given its rather remote location, for a very long time has been on the periphery of attention of traditional scholars and historians in Imperial China. Nevertheless, we are still left with some interesting records that give us a glimpse into the past of Hainan. So the peopling of Hainan Island starts at around 7 to 27,000 years ago. So studies show that these earliest settlers could be the ancestor of the modern-day Hlai people, which are a group of non-Chinese Kradai-speaking people. And the earliest official written records about Hainan Island appeared long after the island has been populated by non-Han people in the Western Han dynasty, which is around 200 years BCE. So in Sima Qian's 史记, we found a passage in 霍直列传 that mentioning a place called Dan'er, which can be identified as today's Hainan by its location and by the description. So we can see the name Dan'er initially means carrying ear ornaments or ears on the shoulders. So which highlights the unusual physical characteristics of the indigenous people in the eyes of the Han people at the time. And it is also possible that this is a name that is a Chinese transcription of a local ethnic word. Okay, and you can see they're called savages with very exotic appearance. And the conquest of Hainan by the Han government also began at around Sima Qian's time. So it was in around 100 or 110 BCE, two new administrative areas, namely Zhuya, the shore of pearls, and Dan'er, were established in Hainan, following the successful military campaign to crush the insurrection by Lü Jia, who was a minister of the king of Nanyue during the ruling of Emperor Wu Di of Han. Okay. And another passage in Han Shu summarizes the Han court's understanding of this exotic piece of land and its people at the time. So the passage correctly locates Hainan, but the exaggeration of the size of the island, which is called extends 1,000 li across the east, west, south, and north, betrays that the Han government at the time probably had not explored the entirety of the island. And brief description of the indigenous people with specific focus on their economic and production activities, local resources, and weaponry reflects the fact that Hainan at the time was probably considered an outpost for the acquisition and trading of valuable resources. And oops. So according to Han Shu, in early Han, there were around 23,000 taxable households and 60 counties established in Hainan. And the island had a sizable population even compared to later dynasties. However, it was not enough to secure the rule of the Han people on this island, especially when the natives were being heavily exploited. So you can see here, the people would rebel against the local government once every few years, and they're killing the officials. So uprisings and rebellions against the Han government were frequent and violent, and to the point that provincial towns would be attacked and local officials killed. So you see here, 这个朱牙太守, the governor of Zhuya, whose name is Sun Xing, were killed by the rebellious indigenous people. And in 43 BCE, the commandery of Zhuya was even abolished under the persuasion of a minister named Jia Juanzhi, in the view of the futile attempts to establish stable and effective ruling over the decades. So here you can say fan, 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 fan. So like in a very short passage, there's like multiple time mentioning of rebellions and betrayal. And so the Han court and the later dynasty actually did not try to regain control of the island, but they tried to regain control of the island, but to very little success. And written records about Hainan from the 3rd to the 5th century has been very scarce. For anyone who knows something about Chinese history would know that from the 3rd to the 5th century of China, we're having a lot of warfare in the mainland area. So the central government didn't really had the time to pay attention to Hainan, which is a really remote island on the edge of the empire. And so Hainan was not under the control or even on the radar of the Chinese Han government most of the time. And little could be said about the interaction between Han people and the indigenous people on the island during this period, except hostile, and that would be putting it somewhat mildly. And the situation came to a change in the beginning of the 6th century. So Lady Xian was the daughter of a local chieftain of an influential indigenous tribe in the coastal Guangdong area. She's a very famous figure in the Guangdong area because she was married to a local governor called Feng Bao, and she was very important in settling a lot of local disputes between indigenous tribes and Han people or Chinese people at the time. So with Lady Xian's intervention, the tension between Han and non-Han people in the Lingnan area in general started to diffuse. So Lady Xian exhibited outstanding intelligence and political sensitivity, as well as bravery and compassion for the local people. In the countless times she helped to mediate conflicts and subdue insurrections of the local tribes. So she convinced thousands of grottos, it's called dong here, which means small remote settlements in Hainan, to submit themselves to the rule of the Chinese government, and contributed greatly to the establishment of a much more stable and extensive control of Hainan by the Sui court. And the Sui dynasty also marks the beginning of increasing Chinese influence in Hainan. Because in the following Tang and Song dynasty, the central government was able to expand its control southwards, establishing commanderies and counties along the coast of the whole island. So on the right, this is a map of 方阵圆合图. So this is a map of Hainan at the time, showing the locations of the commanderies and counties that's ruled under Chinese government rules. So you can see on Hainan, they have counties all over the island, from the north to the south to the east and to the west, and then all along the coastal area. And besides, Hainan also become a rather popular destination, but not of vacations, but of political exiles. And they welcomed numerous officials who were no longer favored by the emperors, including the very famous Tang Chancellor, Li Deyu, and one of the most eminent Chinese poets and literati of all time, Su Shi. So they have a lot of famous people visiting Hainan, even from the past. And as the Chinese regime in Hainan became more and more efficacious during the Tang and Song dynasties, there came a boom in the number of Han immigrants as well. So Han immigrants continued to flood in the following dynasties. As a result, indigenous people in Hainan were forced to adapt to cohabitation and to larger scale social interaction with the incoming Han Chinese immigrants. And it is also during Song Chao when more accurate and detailed description of Hainan and its people emerged. Notable ones include 岭外代答 by Zhou Qufei and 贵海鱼衡志 by Fan Chengda, both written in the 12th century. And the author of these texts worked as local officials in Lingnan area and thus has a more direct and even first-hand experience about the subject matter. So poems, proses, and other literary works written by literati who lived in Hainan also contain relevant information. And not only are these written records much more reliable, and they also contain more vivid details about the daily life of people on the island. So let us focus on the following passages that are of interest to our discussion. So the first one comes from an earlier source called 太平寰宇记 from the 10th century. So we are introduced to a group of indigenous people named Shengli or Wild Li, and whose lifestyle, language, and culture are vastly different from the Han Chinese. So we see that these Shengli people, they do not have walled cities, they enjoy music and alcohol, but who doesn't? And their men wear top knots adorned with combs and ornaments of human teeth, and their women have fine tattooed skin and ear pendants. And they do not have proper medications, but they cook dogs and goats to offer to spirits when they're sick. And this sort of description, although it's short and brief, it's a very fine-grained and realistic depiction, because even nowadays we do have modern records that echoes what was documented 1,000 years ago. The women of the Li people in Hainan do have fine tattooed skin, and this is a picture from Father Safoi's diary. He visited Hainan in the early 20th centuries. And this is a much more recent photos of a Li Zu Fu like a lady in Hai tribe. And she still has this tattooed skin. So we are sure that, or we are more confident, we have more confidence in the records we see after the Song dynasties. Okay. And in later sources, we begin to see a distinction between the different groups of Li people. Zeng Shi stated that people's attempts to differentiate between the Shu Li, which refers to the tame Lis, and the Sheng Li, which refers to the wild Li. The former obeyed county and township administration, while the latter dwelled in mountain grottos, neither disciplined by the government nor under the corvée labor system. So here, the Chinese government at the time were aware that the Li people are actually diverse, heterogeneous group. And Guihai Yuhengzhi provide a more detailed account of the two groups of Li. The settlements scattered around the Limu mountain and those located on the inner ring and closer to the mountain are classified as the wild Li, while those living in the outer ring and are relatively closer to Chinese township belong to the tame Li. And although the tame Li were relatively accessible, they formed their own communities and did not live among the Han people in commanderies and counties. And differences between the wild Li and tame Li extend beyond their location of settlements and whether they are governed by the local governments. Lin Wai Dai Da also noted that the so-called tame Li were actually of various ethnic origins. Some of them maybe shared the same root as the native Li people. Okay, but there were also very interesting. Here is 屬嚟都湖廣福建之間民也. So those Shulis, the tame Li contains scoundrels and rascals from Huguang and Fujian. That's a very mean comment. And a similar account is seen in Guihai Yuhengzhi as well. In his book, Shore of Pearls, Edward Scheffer, who is a very renowned American professor, had a very deep knowledge about Hainan Island. He commented that the so-called scoundrels from Huguang and Fujian may actually be indigenous people from southern China. So they might not be Han Chinese. They might just be indigenous people, but from the mainland continent. And however, Guihai Yuhengzhi also stated that some Fujian merchants at the time joined the Li people after they had lost their fortune in the storm while sailing, meaning that some Han people may also join the mixture. So in a nutshell, the tame Li was already a heterogeneous group of people with different ethnic origins and a big melting pot of various languages. So they maintain close connection to both the wild Li and the Han Chinese on the island, acting as a bridge bringing together the two major ethnic groups. So the interaction between the Li and Han Chinese at the time became rather common in many aspects of their social life. So for example, the Li people established close business ties with the Han people, often trading with them in county markets and making regular business transactions with the Chinese merchants. And there is a following passage in the Guihai Yuhengzhi right after where I cut off. It's very interesting. You see here, he say, the Li people treat them as close family and they do not mind lending money to the merchants. And in the following passage it says, but if you betray them, if you try to deceive them, they will follow you to your house, they will kidnap you and ask for a large ransom. And if you don't pay the large ransom, they're going to kill you. So a very, very interesting and very first-hand experience of interaction with the Li people at the time. And intermarriage between indigenous peoples and the Chinese is also mentioned as early as in the Tang written records. So here you say we have a description talking about how northerners, the northern Han Chinese people, come to the sea, which means Hainan, and then they have this with sort of like witches, and they are living in the middle of the sea and are good at love magic. So they charm the man from the north and marry them. And this sort of a discussion, although the indigenous women are often cast in discriminatory or derogatory light, we can still tell that such ethnic integration through marriage was probably possible, or even sometimes quite common at the time. And also I found this description really interesting because it reminds me of Calypso from Odyssey, when Calypso tried to charm Odysseus from returning to his home. So I guess this is a very common trope in literature anyway. And with prolonged cohabitation and frequent contact in both economic and possibly family life between non-Han and Han people, came the incentive or even pressure to acquire each other's language. So both Lin Wai Dai Da and Gui Hai Yu Heng Zhi note that there is a significant portion of the Li people could speak Chinese, and one could not be able to recognize them that they are non-Chinese, especially when they were wearing Han Chinese clothing. And this is a telltale sign of their Chinese proficiency. And as corollary, bilingualism or even polylingualism might have been quite common at the time, especially among groups of the Tang Li. And some Li people might even have given up living in Li territories and moved to live in Chinese commanderies. So in the prose written by Su Shi, Shu Shangyuan Ye You, so he noted that a night out during the Shangyuan festival, Su Shi remarks that the crowd attending the carnival consisted of both the Han Chinese and indigenous people, Man Yi Zab Yao. And on the other hand, Gui Hai Yu Heng Zhi noted the popularity of the surname Li in the population of the four commanderies, and rightly attributes the surname to the indigenous origin of the Li people. And in fact, even if you visit Hainan nowadays, they do have a lot of people with relatively uncommon surnames that you can hardly find on the mainland China. So a lot of them do have indigenous ancestry. And moreover, despite the central government's vigilance against the indigenous peoples, they eventually had no choice but to recruit native chieftains to assist their ruling in Hainan, as seen here. And not only did they recruited native indigenous chieftains, they recruited female native indigenous chieftains, which is also quite interesting. And so to conclude, from historical records, we can observe that the dynamics between different ethnic groups changed drastically by the time of Song Dynasty in comparison to when Chinese people first set foot on the island. So cohabitation, cooperation, and integration replaced hostility and antagonization as the main trend of this era. And it was also during this period when ancestors of Hainan Min speakers entered the scene. And this particular ecology left a deep impression on the language itself. And before we move on to talk about the language of Hainan Min, we would also like to look at the genetic studies, which can give us a little bit more clue. Okay. So in the recent decades, a genetic analysis has become a popular approach to trace human migration and population history. And by comparing the Y chromosome between different groups, both of which, to be honest, the term mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome was far outside of my comfort zone because I've never done biology in my life, but with the help of ChatGPT, I try my best to understand the paper. So by comparing this Y chromosome, scientists were able to identify the flow of genes, events of admixture, or time of divergence in certain populations. So in the case of Hainan, multiple studies actually shown that the Hlai people in Hainan is a relatively isolated population. Their genetic structure shows little influence of the recent mainland population relocation or admixture, remaining rather homogeneous, meaning the Hlai population is they're relatively not accustomed to intermarriage or accepting mainland like new genes. And on the other hand, the Hainan Han population appears to be a mixture of two components genetically speaking, related to Hlai and to Northern Han Chinese population respectively. So approximately half of their ancestry was from the Beijing Han related population, and half was derived from a Hlai associated source. So based on the genetic analyses of the Hlai and Han population in Hainan, we can postulate that there was a large-scale assimilation of Hlai people into Han Chinese community that took place sometimes in the history of Hainan, but not vice versa. So on the contrary, the Hlai population remained isolated from neighboring groups, which echoes the description of the more secluded wild Li in historical records that we see. And finally, moving on to talk about languages. Okay, but before we start discussing the language of Hainan, we must first clarify the concept of Li that we saw a lot in the past records. So Li is actually an umbrella term used to denote all the non-Han indigenous people on the island. The so-called distinction of wild Li and tame Li was only referred to their social behaviors, but is not in any way an accurate classification of the non-Han people's ethnic origins. So, as we've mentioned briefly, the Li is a heterogeneous in nature, including various indigenous tribes of close or distant genealogical relationship, and also of different non-Han immigrants from southern China, or even Han immigrants from different origins. So instead of struggling with the very confusing term Li, for the purpose of our discussion, we'll be regarding the ethnic groups as a communities of speakers of the same languages. So in present-day Hainan, Hlai and Be are the two most widely spoken non-Sinitic languages, with nearly 800,000 and 600,000 speakers respectively. And we believe that the two languages, which belong to different branches of the Kradai language family, have played a major role in shaping the linguistic landscape of Hainan and influencing the formation of Hainan Min. So the Hlai languages indeed form a branch of their own. They have split off from other Kradai languages at least 3,000 years ago, and internally they can be further divided into several dialects. And nowadays, speakers of different Hlai languages scattered in the center, southern, and western part of the island. And here you can see all the green areas are the Hlai speakers. Okay. And the name Li in historical records was actually a Chinese adaptation of the word Hlai, which means man or people in the native Hlai language. And the Be language is a closer relative to the Zhuang languages spoken in present-day Guangxi than it is to the Hlai languages, although the two branches are both from the Kradai language family. And the migration of the Be speakers to Hainan started as early as in 200 BCE, during the late Warring States period, and lasted all the way into the 6th century. And now speakers of Be are concentrated in the northern part of the island in the county of Lingao. It's the yellow area here. And given Be speakers' greater proximity to the long-established Chinese township and their high level of Sinicization, some scholars believe that the Be speakers are tamely mentioned in historical records. And actually, if you go to ask a Lingao person, a Be language speakers, they probably wouldn't realize that they are not Chinese, that they consider themselves as Han Chinese already, and they have their customs very similar to traditional Han Chinese customs, but their language is not a Sinitic language. Okay. And for Hainan Min, we'll put our focus here, finally come back to it. So Hainan Min's formation began in the 12th century, much later than the arrival of Be and Hlai Be and Klai speakers. So when waves of Southern Min-speaking immigrants from Fujian come to Hainan and brought with them their languages, so they lived side by side with speakers of non-Sinitic languages for centuries, and the prolonged language contact has resulted in numerous features caused by contact-induced transfer in the phonology, lexicon, and syntax of Hainan Min. And the previous sections had already provided us with some general ideas about the context situation. But through examining various linguistic features of Hainan Min, we may be able to recover some more details of the interaction. So let's begin by looking at the phonological feature of Hainan Min. And so scholars have noted that there are a number of features that are uniquely found in the Sinitic languages and indigenous languages of Hainan. The first is the presence of implosive like b and d. And while implosives are present in some African languages and Southeast Asian languages like Vietnamese and some Thai dialects, they are only attested in around 13.4% of languages in the world. In Sinitic languages, implosives are extremely rare, and their existence in a number of Hainan Min dialects and some other Sinitic languages on the island is no doubt a result of contact with languages that inherently possess these sounds, such as the Kradai languages like Hlai and Be. And this already been pointed out by Professor Li Fanggui in like 1930s or something. And another notable feature of the language in Hainan is the lack of aspirated stops and affricates like p, t, k, ch. And these features, though common among world languages, it's actually a very rare development for Sinitic languages because these sounds exist in Middle Chinese and Old Chinese, and they are very generally well preserved in most Sinitic languages. To be more specific, aspirated sounds in some Hainan languages underwent fricatization and lost their stop qualities. For example, p become f, t become h, and k become h, and t becomes s. So here is a recording of a Haikou Min that I got from RIBiLT Pingtai, and it contains some of the features mentioned above. So I'm assuming that nobody in this room understands what it says, but there's some interesting trait. It said 玩貓嘅時候吃到嗰加水話乜袋咩啊？乜袋咩叫阿弟啊？話乜袋咩啊？袋咩啊？It's actually 細名。So it's a word that begins with an S, but in Hainan Min it becomes a T. It's like 袋咩啊？阿弟 is 阿四 number 4. So it's also an S to T fricatization. And Luamia, Lua was actually implosive sound. It's big, die. Luamia. I can hear it again. In casual speech, it doesn't have the very clear implosive quality, though. Sui is 牛角村. So sui is actually, it comes from the TSH. This is, so I'm sorry, affricatives. Okay. Dong điểm điểm, like as 中心點. So 中心 become the, it's all becomes a stop. And then you had diam, it's already originally just like a dental stop, and it becomes an implosive. It's like diam, like okay. So it's just, I want to give you an idea of what Hainan Min actually sound like in real life. Okay. Oh, no. Okay. Hey. So this table is a summary of the presence or absence of the mentioned feature in the languages in Hainan. So there are 6 distinct features in total, and the presence of each feature carries 1 point. So the closer the scores of the languages are, the more similar their synchronic phonological systems are. But you can only depend on, the more the score, it means the more similar unique features that they possess. And here we can see that some Hainan Min varieties and the Danzhou dialect, which is another Sinitic variety on the island, and Be, they have the highest score. And this map is a visualization of the level of distribution of the set phonological features of different Hainan languages in relation to their geographical locations. So one important observation is that languages with the highest scores, Hainan Min, the Danzhou dialect, and the Be language, form a cluster that is located in the northern part of the island. And their high scores indicate that they all possess these rare features and are quite similar in terms of their phonological structures. And given that distinct genealogical relationship, these similarities should not be viewed as inherited of traits from the common ancestor or mere coincidence. Rather, these features are more likely the result of intense language contact. So this purple circle is Hainan Min, and this pink circle is Be language, and this browny circle is actually Danzhou. It's a Chinese dialect which believes to have Yue lineage. And then, but you can see all of them cluster in the northern part of the island. And other than synchronically shared phonological features, shared diachronic sound change will also be another good indicators of intense contact, as it implies that speakers of these languages coexisted and interacted during certain sound changes to make it spread. We have identified 8 historical sound changes that took place in various languages of Hainan as well, which are listed here. And table 2, this also shows the participation of a particular language in these 8 sound changes. And again, Hainan Min, the Danzhou dialect, and the Be language lead the chart, while Hlai language, which is also a very important language on the island, do not actually participate in a lot of the sound change. So for figure 2, it's a very similar picture to figure 1, meaning that these languages, in particular Hainan Min and Be, have indeed undergone long-term and intense contact to the point that they have developed near identical phonological systems through various shared sound change. And we can now arrive at a few conclusions. First, the north of Hainan has been the most important hub of interaction and integration for different ethnic groups. Long-term cohabitation and intense contact took place in this region, as reflected in the convergence of phonological systems across different languages. And given the long history of settlement and development by the Han immigrants in this region, there is no surprise. And second, the near identical phonological systems of the Be and Hainan Min suggest that the 2 languages have undergone intense contact. Comparing to the Hlai language, which does not really share a lot of features with the Sinitic languages in general, the proposition that Be people correspond to the more Sinicized tame Li and the Hlai people correspond to the more secluded wild Li can be supported linguistically. And third, the convergence of phonological system of Hainan Min and Be can be best explained by the imposition of certain language features onto another language under long-term social bilingualism or language shift. In short, speakers of a language that inherently possess implosives, like Be or Hlai languages, when acquiring a Sinitic language that has no implosives, may unconsciously pronounce certain sound in Sinitic languages as implosives due to imperfect learning. if the number of this group of bilinguals or shifting speakers constitute a significant portion of the total population, especially during the earliest stage of formation of the language, they would likely be accepted by the community and becomes a feature of their own language. And therefore, the feature of the Bei language or Hai language might be integrated into Hainan Min in this form. And the presence of shared sound change implies a similar situation. A bilingual speaker may transfer certain ongoing sound change in one of their languages into their second language, and thus propagates the spread of sound change across language borders. Hence, based on the highly similar phonological structure of Bei and Hainan Min, one can tell bilingualism and language shift was probably long-term and prevalent social phenomena. And for the lexicon part, it's surprising that we actually don't see major lexical borrowing from non-Chinese languages in present-day Hainan Min, which is actually quite interesting. Only 10%, around 10% of Hainan Min's common morpheme come from non-Chinese languages, and fewer than 2% of them are of Bei origin. And this is not a very significant number because when we compare it to Cantonese, which we consider it's less peripheral than Hainan Min, Cantonese has at least 13% of its basic lexicon coming from Zhuang borrowed words. And they have even more coming from Momian borrowed words. So some scholars said around 20% of Cantonese daily vocabulary items are actually of non-Sinitic origins. Another notable feature of Hainan Min is that its lexicon contains a group of reverse order words. And contrary to the word order in Chinese, this group of words has their modifier after their heads. So soup noodles become noodle soup, mi ho, and like a small cow become cow small, gu niao. And nevertheless, this morphological rule is no longer productive. So you cannot just go out and make new words using it. And all of these are just fossils in the lexicons. And the lack of borrowed word from non-Sinitic languages and the presence of reverse order words in Hainan Min seems to contradict the conclusion of what we have previously discussed. Intense language contact, social bilingualism, and language shift would, generally speaking, result in heavy borrowing and transfer of morphological rules. But this is not the case in Hainan Min. And we'll explore this peculiar phenomena later in our discussion. And lastly, scholars also notice Northern Hainan Min dialects do not differentiate between matrilineal and patrilineal senior relatives, meaning that they call senior relatives on both their mother's and father's side with the same term. And lacking of this differentiation is actually quite uncommon among Sinitic languages because generally speaking, we differentiate patrilineal from matrilineal relatives for societal reasons. And however, this is actually the norm in Bei and Hai. The fact that we can observe this influence of indigenous culture and language in the kinship term of Hainan Min indicates that the interaction of Han Chinese and non-Han Chinese was by no means restricted to public domains, but it probably extends into familial settings, possibly through extensive intermarriage as well. So in terms of syntax, evidence of past contact is also abundant. Studies have discovered that many multifunctional morphemes in Hainan Min share their polysemous pattern with corresponding morphemes in Bei, and this is believed to be the result of contact-induced grammaticalization. In short, speakers of Hainan Min discover that a certain morpheme in Bei has multiple functions, and they choose a corresponding morpheme in Hainan Min and derived similar polysemous pattern. Word order is another feature that manifests the influence of language contact between Hainan Min and indigenous languages. And it is the focus of my dissertation. After 40 minutes of discussion, we finally arrive here. And I have identified 5 types of syntactic constructions in Hainan Min, employing a word order that would be considered ungrammatical in either Southern Min varieties or Sinitic languages in general. But they are in line with the word order of corresponding structures in Bei and Hai. So the data in the following discussion comes from my dissertation, which is based on my own fieldwork in Hainan. I conducted on-site field research to collect first-hand data on 3 Hainan dialect, Haikou here, Qionghai here, and Gangmen, which belong to 3 different subgroups of Hainan Min. And I highlighted 5 types of construction with unusual word order in Hainan Min. The first one is the post-verbal locative prepositional phrases. So in Sinitic languages, locative prepositional phrases indicating the location of an action which takes place in have to precede the verb. However, in Hainan Min, these PP can follow even complicated verb phrases. And the second construction is the post-verbal prepositional phrases introducing beneficiary or maleficiary. While in Southern Min, this type of beneficiary would be introduced by a pre-verbal comitative prepositional phrase like 共醫 or 及醫, okay. And the third type is the verb-object resultative construction. And in modern Sinitic languages, such word order is generally forbidden, save for a few fossilized expressions. But it is highly productive in Hainan Min nowadays. And the fourth construction is the post-verbal adverbs and manner adverbial phrases. They are also highly unusual features that are attested rarely among even Southern Sinitic languages. And the fifth construction is the post-nominal modifier phrase, is another modifying construction that violates the usual word order in Sinitic languages. So these word order, although highly unusual for Sinitic languages, are most common word order in typical VO languages with strong head initial preferences, like the Kradai languages to which both Be and Hlai belong. Thus, it would be unlikely that this word order peculiarities in Hainan Min has nothing to do with their very close neighbors. And second, I also want to point out that all these constructions are examples of contact-induced word order change without word order change, as proposed by Professor Hainan in his 2008 paper. So simply put, speakers of Hainan Min did not just copy certain word order pattern from the source language and change the linear arrangement of the phrase and words accordingly. Instead, these 5 types of constructions are all derived from pre-existing structures or discourse options that have congruent surface structure and are readily available. And I will try to illustrate this using the following 3 case studies. So the first one is the post-verbal prepositional phrases that indicating the location of an ongoing action. And for anyone who's interested, because this is actually quite a complicated discussion, so we already have a paper published in 2024 that was co-written by me and Professor Kwok, and it was published in 东亚语言学报 I think they only have a French name for this. It's a Cahier de linguistique Asie orientale. So CLAO, for anyone can just look for it. And so I'm just picking out some of the more relevant and important insights from the paper to share with you here because of the limited time. So in most Sinitic languages, locative PP indicating the location of an ongoing action has to appear after the VP. And such word order is already settled or attested by Tang Dynasty, and it's the common practice in basically all Sinitic languages. However, in Hainan Min, they allow such locative prepositional phrases to appear after the VP, even when the VP is a complex VP itself. And even more interestingly, most Sinitic languages would not allow post-verbal locative PP after a complex VP, which already contains some sort of a complement. For example, object, like here, a group of people hit a thief by the road. So it's something like that. And if you speak Chinese, you will know there's no way you can speak a sentence in this word order and make it valid, or it's ungrammatical anyhow. But in Hainan Min, this is actually a very common way to speak, to say a sentence. And sometimes this locative PP can even appear after a resultative complement introduced by a de. So here, 以開啲那個話都掉都都都掉一咗好啦。I'm not very familiar with the Qionghai variety. I'm sorry. It says so. He sleeps soundly on a chair. Okay, and again, in Chinese, in generally Sinitic languages, if you have a resultative complement introduced by a de, you cannot put anything after it. The sentence ends there. It has to end there. But in Hainan Min, you can put apparently a locative prepositional phrase after the resultative complement, and then afterwards you have the sentence final particle. So this is very peculiar in both where they put the locative prepositional phrases and how they actually allow it to appear after a complex VP. And this sort of putting the PP after complex VP is a violation to the postverbal constraint that was proposed by Professor Zhang Min, which he believed to be applicable to all Sinitic languages. And we can see this postverbal PP is actually very common in both Klai and Bear languages. Here I show you some of the examples. They have the PP appear after with the verb. And then this is very similar to what we just see. You have grandma, the false grandma still shakes on the top of the bed. So this on top of the bed is appear after shake. Okay, and postverbal locative PP is the most common word order in Klai and Bear, and comparisons with other Kradai languages also indicate that such word order is a default and inherent word order in these two languages, and also in Kradai languages in general, or to be honest, in generally VO languages, because it's actually very weird for Chinese to put this PP in front of the VP. This is typologically speaking a peculiarity of the Chinese languages. Generally, normal VO languages have the PP after the VP. However, we would say that at first glance, we would say, okay, so Hainan Min, the postverbal locative PP, is extremely free. You can put it after basically everything and in all circumstances. But no, under finer examination, we realize that such postverbal PP actually pose a requirement to the TAM, the tense aspect and mood system, or the tense aspect of the sentence or of the VP. So we find that for Haikou Min and Qionghai Min, this postverbal PP implies a progressive readings. So if the VP or the sentence itself, it's a perfect aspect sentence or perfect aspect VP, then you cannot place the PP after the VP. It will form an ungrammatical sentence. And with even finer examination, we realize that there is actually a pre-existing postverbal progressive or durative marker in Hainan Min that is grammaticalized from locative PP. So in Haikou, you can place do there, be there at the end of or after the VP to indicate that it is durative or progressive action. And for Qionghai, you have similar, you have here or there, you place it after the VP to indicate that it's a durative or progressive aspect. So we can see that the Hainan Min postverbal locative prepositional phrases was actually derived from analogy with its postverbal progressive or durative marker. So it has a base from which it derives such word order. It's not just a direct copy of the Bear and Klai word order, and it's restricted by this analogy as well because it has to comply with the expectual requirements of this format or of this construction. And a second case is the postverbal prepositional phrases introducing a beneficiary. So in Klai and Bear, this postverbal PP can introduce an extra argument that undoubtedly has a beneficiary reading. For example, here you have in Klai, are you really not willing to find it for me? And it's introduced by sort of, this is a dative marker, and then for me. And here I took pity on the orphan, so I help him to look after it. So this is also sort of like a plain beneficiary offering service for other person. And here, this is the bare example. You can say the old man nodded several times and only then show them the way. But it was written as like then point way to them or point way for them. Okay. And however, in normal Southern Min, or generally speaking, in Sinitic languages, a lot of the time such beneficiary is indicated by a pre-verbal element, sometimes with a commutative prepositional phrase. But in Hainan Min, we do find similar use of this post-verbal beneficiary PP. So here you can see 話少來幫咪魯會木好話 so you open door to me. And this sort of like open door to me or for me is also marking a plain beneficiary. But if we look rather closely, we would see that this is not just an isolated case. We can actually draw a path of grammaticalization for this construction. And it started with the dative construction, which is common in Southern Min dialects in general. So in Haikou Min, or in basically all Hainan Min dialects, they have this sort of post-verbal PP that indicates the endpoint of an action in a dative construction. And from this dative construction, we can have a bridging context of having a dative construction or recipient beneficiary. Like here, I bought a very pretty dress for her. This is sort of like I'm benefited because I receive a certain things. So we can still use the same dative constructions to express similar meanings. And here in Hainan Min, you can express this sort of bridging context with dative construction and recipient beneficiary using the same post-verbal PP construction as well. And in most of the Hainan Min dialect, they also allow this. You don't actually receive anything, but you just get benefited by other people's service in the open door for me sort of construction. And in one Hainan Min dialect, the Gangmen Min variety, they even accept some really beneficiary. Like if you say open door for me, you can still find like a direction of the surface. It can be interpreted as a very abstract act of transfer. And here you can have the I draw eyebrow for my younger sisters, or even I absolve them of their sins. And this is a very plain beneficiary. And in Gangmen Min, they also allowed this sort of an expression to be expressed by a post-verbal prepositional phrases. However, in no Hainan Min dialect allow a deputative beneficiary. So instead for do something for somebody, that's sort of a beneficiary item, you cannot express it with the post-verbal PP. But anyhow, we can see that if we only look at this sort of the most extreme plain beneficiary, we would say, okay, it's really peculiar for Hainan Min to have this construction, post-verbal construction expressing this sort of an argument. But if we put it together, back into context, we can see it's not just a copy of the be or hlai word order, but it actually derives from a pre-existing dative construction. And we can see a rather clear roadmap to go from a dative construction to a recipient beneficiary with the with receiving like a certain thing, so you benefit from it, to a more abstract form of transfer to, I would say, like, even this is also like you can interpret it as a abstract form of transfer. So I draw eyebrow for my younger sister. So my younger sister received a new pair of eyebrows, or the act of someone drawing eyebrows for them, or I absolve them for their sins. So I can say, so they receive absolution of sins. Okay. And the third and the last type of peculiar word order is the post-verbal manner adverbial phrases. So in Well, in both Hai and Bear, and also a lot of Kradai languages in general, and a lot of VO languages in general, manner adverbial phrases describing the action appears after the VP, and or even after like a verb classifier or something. And here you can see we have the lui lui, that's an idiophone. You have on, which means still or stable, and in this case it means like standing there still. And then you have this lang lang, which so it's like nicely, cut his hair nicely, okay. But in most Semitic languages, such adverbial, adverbial phrases can only, when they are, really adverbs, they can only appear before the VP, but not after the VP. But in Hainan Min, they allow something like this, like, I hit him one fist heavy, heavy. Or he sits by the doorway, quiet, very quiet. Or is the book placed on the bed properly? This is actually table, but they use the etymon of bed. So we can see that this sort of postposed adverbial manner phrases is extremely rare among Sindicic languages. And they can appear after the VP or even after verbal classifier, like here, one fist is the verbal classifier, and then they can appear after locative PP complement, sit at the door there. Okay, this is the verbal post-verbal locative PP complement, and then you have the adverbial phrases here. So it's peculiar, but then if we examine them closely, it's not that peculiar, because we realize that such post-verbal adverbs and in terms of pragmatics, they are the focus of the sentence. For example, if we haven't started eating yet and I'm asking, well, start eating, and then I can only say 回家加梅啊咧, eat, like started eating, because the whole focus of the sentence would be to eat. So you cannot use 加梅回家咧, you can say like eat fast or something. However, when somebody is already eating and you want them to eat faster, then you can use the phrase 加梅回家咧, like eat faster. So here we can see sort of like a post-verbal adverb is actually, it requires the adverb part to be the focus of the sentence. It has to carry the emphasis of meaning. And this sort of pragmatic meaning, I don't know if it reminds you of anything. It actually is very similar to the complement, the resultative complement introduced by 得, 就是很快地跑和跑得很快. So we would say, so the post-verbal manner adverbial phrases in Hainan Min, syntactically, it's actually a secondary predicate. It's not like a modifier or an adjunct. It's actually a predicate. And in terms of pragmatics, it's actually the focus. And here, such contrast of preverbal and postverbal manner descriptive elements in terms of focus or pragmatic value, it's actually a very common Sinitic trait. Anything happen before the verb, it's just, it's not the focus. After the verb, when it's towards the end of the sentence, it's in natural focus position, and that would be interpreted as the focus. So it's the inherently Sinitic information structure that gives rise to the so-called post-verbal manner adverbs. So pragmatically speaking, they're just placing the focus at the end of the sentence, but it's placed in a syntactic structure. It looks weird on the surface. Okay. So the word order change we just talked about and we observed in Hainan Min is vastly different from that in non-Sinitic languages in China. Because in the latter's case, which means usually when non-Sinitic languages copy Sinitic word order, they copy the linear order of the phrase with no restriction on the linguistic sort. And it is done with the clear and straightforward intention of replicating the Chinese word order. And however, it is definitely not the case for speakers of Hainan Min, because when they change their word order, they're subjected to a lot of restriction, semantically, pragmatically, or syntactically. practically speaking. So they are not just copying them, they are developing some pre-existing structure into a word order on surface that look akin to the non-Sinitic word order. And we can see that from our discussion. Pre-existing congruent surface structures and semantic or pragmatic motivation is very important for such development. And reanalysis as well as analogy is really common in the process of the development of such word order. And we believe this difference in terms of how this word order is derived is actually a reflection of the distinct socioeconomic ecology in which Hainan Min is formed. So in the case of Hainan Min, as per our discussion earlier, the speech community faces continuous influx of Min-speaking immigrants, so that the relative size of the group of indigenous bilinguals and shifting speakers to that of the Chinese Min speakers is gradually diminishing over time. So besides, indigenous bilinguals and shifting speakers, when trying to integrate into a Chinese community, would likely be of less advantageous social status. So in this case, sinolectic features, meaning that features that could be easily identified as non-Chinese, would be on one hand more easily noticed by the shifting speakers themselves and thus intentionally removed from their speech, and on the other hand, more likely to get rejected by the speech community as a whole and become obsolete. So direct lexical borrowings or word order change, like direct copy of word order, would be more valuable to such a rejection of the community in general. So okay, I know we are running out of time. So far we have looked at different kinds of materials and tried to reconstruct linguistic ecology of Hainan Min in the past. And I hope by this point we have all realized that under the pretense of a strict segregation between the Li and Han Chinese in historical records, integration and assimilation of the peoples, languages, and cultures have been happening on this island all the time to a degree so profound that we would not be able to appreciate the uniqueness of any of them without looking at the other. So when we say we're going back into the history of Hainan through the looking glass, so at the end of it, we can know that the looking glass is truly a looking glass. We cannot understand ourselves without looking at the others. And I think this is true for all Chinese dialects, because all Chinese dialects are formed under intense language, especially Southern Chinese variety. They're formed under intense context situations. And I think Hainan Min in this case it's a very good example for us to appreciate the beauty of the thing. And I know we are running out of time, but at the end of the sharing, at the end of the sharing, it's still not yet end. Okay. I would like to take this opportunity to first express my sincere gratitude to Professor Kwok Chi, who is my supervisor for my PhD dissertation. And without his support and guidance, I would not have completed my research. And I would also like to thank all my informants because during my stay in Hainan, they have treated me like a friend, like a sister, and like a daughter. And it's my huge honor to have worked with them throughout the time. And I hope my presentation has conveyed a tiny portion of the unique charm of Hainan, and that one day you would want to visit it yourself. So again, thank you. Also thank Professor Lee for inviting me to the talk, and I'm really sorry for overrun. Thank you very much.